Good afternoon, everybody. Who was here for my Smart Cities IoT session earlier this morning? Hands up. And seriously, you came back. Who wasn't here for my Smart Cities IoT session this morning? Luckily, straight after my session, our platinum sponsor, Intel, will be doing another fabulous session on smart cities and talking to you about some of the wonderful solutions that are being built on the AWS and Intel combined platform. So stay around afterwards. Does anyone know what my favourite number is? It's a number between 4 and 6. Someone guess. My favourite number is 5. In 22 minutes' time, I'm going to ask you to remember what my favourite number is. I love coming to Singapore, as I said in my earlier session. When I'm not having business conversations with customers, I love to talk about those top 3 things that my Singapore friends or co-workers or customers like to talk about. Food, clothing, and smartphones. So for those of you who love to take photographs, get your smartphones out. And there will be how many slides that I want you to take a photograph of? 5 slides. So look out for the particular slides we're going to have a look at. Olivier mentioned that Amazon Web Services spends a lot of time starting with the customer and working backwards. My role's no different. I spend a lot of time with customers, either old customers, current customers, or future potential customers, talking about their challenges, the solutions they're trying to build, the priorities for their departments, agencies, hospitals, education organisations, not-for-profits. Who's ever seen Rogers' innovation adoption curve before? Not the original version, I hope. So Everett Rogers wrote a book called Diffusion of Innovations in 1962, just a smidge before I was born. And he coined this analogy for how new technologies or new solutions or new services are adopted, and he called it his innovation adoption curve. And essentially it says when a new technology or capability comes to the market, only a very small handful of people adopt that. And it's a bell curve, so it's a distribution. And that first wave of people who adopt that bleeding edge technology, if you like, he coins the innovators. And then as momentum picks up and visibility picks up and people become more aware of the technology, more people start to take on that new service, that new capability. So they're called the early adopters. And as the technology matures and it becomes more broad in its reach, we then have the early majority. And then the top of that bell curve is sometimes colloquially known as the tipping point. And when the market hits that point, from there on, there are more people than not who are adopting that new technology or that new capability. And then as we start to move through that technology adoption wave, we have the late majority, and at the very end, the laggards. And it would be unfair to term the public sector as laggards, because they are not laggards. However, 4 years ago when I first joined Amazon Web Services, it would be fair to say that when I had conversations with them about the public cloud, the only public sector customers who were talking back to me about how great that was were the innovators at the very start of the curve. I also had conversations with private sector customers because I was trying to find out what are the benefits of the public cloud for your organisation, so I can translate and talk about those benefits to my public sector customers to encourage them that they could also take up the benefits and the advantages of the cloud for their own organisations. So as I talked to our private sector customers, they would talk to me about the cloud brings all these benefits to my organisation, like agility, like competitiveness, like speed to market, like lowering my cost base, helping me move from a capital expenditure model to an operating expenditure model, failing fast, failing cheaply, introducing new services, introducing new products. I was pumped. I'd go and see my public sector customers and say, I need to talk to you about what your private sector counterparts are doing with the public cloud. And they said to me, that's fantastic. What about security? What about compliance? Does my data stay onshore? Oh, there's a lot of risk with that cloud thing. What about my legacy apps? What about my new data center I've just built? And what about my data classification schema? So you can see 2 different sets of conversations But for the more astute observers in the audience, what my private sector customers were talking to me about 4 years ago was a lead indicator to what my public sector customers are talking to me about today. So now, many of my public sector customers are well and truly working their way up the innovation adoption curve, while our private sector customers are now in the late majority. The next smartphone photograph I'd like you to take, this is number 2. A lot of customers talk to me about what does the journey to the cloud look like? So no two journeys are the same, but a lot of them are really similar. They all start at the left-hand end of that journey, and they all, hopefully, end up somewhere towards the right-hand end of that journey. Public sector customers are usually very risk-averse. So they spend a lot of time doing a lot of research into the cloud before they make a decision. When they do make a decision, they usually try to pilot or something or do a proof of concept. When they choose the workload, it usually has to be something low risk. It's low profile. So when the public cloud goes wrong, and it always does, at least there won't be too much fallout from me getting it wrong. So dev and test is a good starting point for many of our public sector customers. It's a spiky workload. When I need to do a lot of development and testing, I need a lot of it. And when I'm not testing, I don't need any of it. So because of the spiky nature of the workload, it lends itself well to the public cloud. So they'll try dev and test on us. And it will actually work, and it's reasonably secure, and it was reasonably reliable, and it was reasonably cheap, but one is not a trend. So they'll try another workload. Storage, backup, disaster recovery is usually roughly the second workload a lot of our public sector customers try on us. A lot of that decision is not so much risk-driven, but it's cost-driven. When they look at the cost of their current storage solutions, whether it's on-premise SANs or NASs, if it's off-premise solutions like storage backups or Iron Mountain-based solutions, and they look at the costs of those, then they look at the costs of our online storage services, so our object store, simple storage service, S3, at less than 3 cents per gigabyte per month. And then they look at Glacier, which Peter Moore announced is finally coming to Singapore for half a cent per gigabyte per month for long-term archival and storage of data. So the financials are usually compelling enough for them to get a customer to try storage or backup or DR as their second workload on AWS. But 2 out of 2 is not a trend. So quite often they'll try new applications next. So these come in usually fairly early in a journey to the cloud. They've heard about AWS. They've got a team who've got some experience with AWS. A couple of them have had accounts for some time. They do a lot of work on weekends or after hours on AWS. They've come to their decision makers with an idea, and the decision maker says, let's have a go at that. There's not too much legacy integration required. There's not a lot of back-end work. It's not a brownfields project. And hey, if we get it wrong, we won't do too much damage. And believe it or not, quite often that one works. Then they look at their digital assets, their websites, their content management systems, their open data. SLA presented to us this morning on the Common Web Platform. And they'll start to put their websites, their government department, agency, organisation website on us, the content management system that sits behind us. Maybe we were just lucky. So then they'll try analytics. Then they'll have a use case for developing a number of mobile applications, whether they're Android apps or iOS apps, and they'll start to launch those on the AWS platform. Then they'll start to look at some of the small to medium-sized line of business applications, a records management system perhaps, a supply chain management system, a logistics system, a HR system, a payroll system. Nothing too important, nothing too high profile just yet. 5 out of 5 or 6 out of 6 is not necessarily a trend, but it's not bad. It's when we get to that point that public sector customers usually start thinking about data center migration. If they're coming up to a decision point where they need to extend the life of an existing data center or replace an existing data center, it's a very expensive decision for a government customer to make. And it's not a decision they make lightly. But with 6 or 7 different data points on AWS now working in production that are running securely and reliably and cost effectively, they usually start to talk to us about, can I avoid building my new data center, migrating to that new data center, consolidating in that whole of government shared services data center? And it's not long after that conversation that we start to talk about their most mission critical applications, whether it's their enterprise resource planning systems, ERP, their Oracle e-business suite, their SAP R3 instance, whatever it may be. And it's when we get to that part of the customer journey that we start to talk about what we call all in. And they almost flip that diagram on its head and say, are there any remaining workloads in my organization that I would not put on AWS? And usually there's a couple. If it's an old mainframe workload, an AS400 workload, probably not. Run it into the ground and replace it with a net new workload as and when it's time to retire it and replace it. But essentially, if it's a Windows-based workload or a Linux-based workload, there's a pretty fair chance we'll be able to run it. The third photograph I'd like you to take. What's stopping customers? Why are they not broadly adopting the cloud in greater numbers with more speed? Usually because they haven't worked through those barriers to adoption that Peter Moore talked about in his introduction this morning. It's a sequential process largely. You start at the bottom and you work your way up. I can tell you I've worked with many customers who've jumped to broad adoption of the cloud and put workloads into production only to see that come unstuck because they forgot about the policy. They didn't have the definition right. We hadn't worked our way through security or compliance issues. We actually didn't have the right acquisition mechanism in place. We hadn't thought about reskilling our people. We hadn't changed the culture of the organization. So there's almost a sequential process that we go through a lot of our new customers today. We get the definition of the cloud right, so we adopt that NIST definition that Peter mentioned this morning. We talk about what is the policy of the organization as far as the cloud goes. Is it at least cloud neutral? Is it at best cloud first or cloud native? We then work through a whole series of security and compliance related issues. What's our security posture look like? How does that compare with what you do at the moment? These are the standards that we adhere to. Which standards do you use in your government data center? These are the independent auditors who go through our security standards. Which auditors do you use for yours? And we get to a common sense conversation about, okay, so which platform has the best underlying security profile and where are my workloads most likely to be secure rather than not? We then talk about acquisition. Priya did a great session just before lunch about what are those things we could learn from others who've gone before us and tried to acquire or procure cloud as if it was a physical something that we've been procuring for the last 100 years. A lot of procurement mechanisms are designed to procure bridges and roads and trains and rolling stock, but they don't lend themselves to a cloud world or a utility-based environment. Certainly not one where you pay as you go. Certainly not one where there's no upfront contracts. Certainly not one where there's a history of 62 price reductions since we were formed. And then we work on the skills. How do we reskill your teams? How do we retool them? How do they work in this agile public cloud-based world? How do we change the culture of the organization where failure is something that is accepted and embraced rather than something to be avoided at all costs? So security is one of those layers. It's the third layer, the second layer in the conversation around security and compliance. Mark Ryland touched on security in his keynote this morning. There are a whole range of global security standards that we adhere to in every one of our 16 regions around the world. Not the least of which are the ISO standards that we adhere to, the ISO 27000s, through to specific ISOs like 27018 for data privacy in cloud-based workloads. We also have regional security and compliance standards we need to adhere to. In the European Union, it'll be the Data Protection Act and the model clauses. We have country-specific compliance regimes. In the US, it'll be FedRAMP, or it'll be HIPAA for health-related information. In Singapore here, it's MTCS. In Australia, it's IRAP through the Australian Signals Directorate. But we adhere to these compliance standards in each one of the 16 regions around the world because we don't know which region you may want to host certain workloads in now or in the future. We are then audited against each of those compliance standards, mostly on an annual basis, but with some of the standards on a 6-monthly basis. And those audit reports are either available up on the public artifact site or under an NDA they're available to customers to review at their own time and leisure. Cost is another conversation topic that comes up in many of our public sector conversations, but it will cost me more to go to the cloud. Will it? What was it going to cost you to migrate to your new data center? What was it going to cost you anyway to move off Oracle onto SQL Server? What was it going to cost you to replace your fleet of servers every 4 years? So we have a history. We have a flywheel. So the Amazon flywheel is a concept that talks about as we go to our wholesalers to buy more hardware to fill our data centers, we negotiate an even better price point. We pay less this time around than what we paid last time around. Because we've bought the wholesale goods at a lower price, we can reduce the cost of supplying services next month compared to what it was 12 months ago. When we reach that new low price point, some of the customers who may have been sitting on the fence because the prices were just a little bit higher than what they wanted, say, you know what, at that price, I'm in. So we get an influx of new customers every time there's a price reduction. When we get an influx of new customers, our utilization goes up. When our utilization goes up, guess what we need to do? We need to buy more hardware from the wholesalers. When we go back to them this time around, we say, oh, this time it's an even bigger order. So we get an even bigger price break. So we reduce the prices again, and then more customers jump in. And then our utilization goes up again. And this flywheel just keeps spinning, but gains momentum and gains speed to the point where, over time, customers benefit from our economies of scale. We have a pay-as-you-go model. There are no upfront contracts. You can use this once and never use this again. You can use this 1,000 times. There's no minimum spend. There's a click-through agreement if you want, or there's an enterprise agreement for large public sector organisations. But we have an on-demand price scheme, and we have discounts built into that depending on how much capacity you want to use and how much of that you want to reserve in advance. With some of our services like storage and data transfer, we also have a construct for pricing that's built around the more you use, the less you pay. So we have mechanisms built into some of our pricing regimes that reward customers for doing more on us rather than less. We have tools like Cost Explorer that enable you to produce standard reports or custom reports that tell you about your utilization of AWS services so that you can see exactly where your spend is and you can identify the areas where you have the potential to reduce some of those costs. We have a new AWS budgets tool. So this was in response to a lot of our public sector customers who told us that they wanted a tool that enabled them to monitor a budget for a specific department, division, or section within their agency so that they could, in the early days, limit the amount that they spent on AWS. I'm going to give them a budget of so many $1,000s per month, but can you tell me when that hits $1,500? Can you tell me again when it hits $1,750, and can you definitely tell me when it hits $2,000? So tools where you can start to set different tolerances or different budget levels across different areas of your organisation. And finally, to make this a lot simpler for our customers, we introduced a service called Trusted Advisor. So Trusted Advisor runs across your entire Amazon infrastructure, and it looks at 4 dimensions: cost optimization, performance, security, and fault tolerance, and makes recommendations for you how you can improve any or all of those 4 different dimensions, including where you're spending too much money with this. Did you know you've got all these servers over here where the utilization is below this much? Did you know you've got servers over here that are never used from Friday night until Monday morning? The tool, Trusted Advisor, actually makes recommendations. In fact, 2.6 million recommendations since 2013, a large percentage of which have been adopted and put in place by our customers that have saved them more than $350 million since then. And did I mention the history of 62 price reductions? So when we work our way through this conversation, cost becomes less of an issue when I talk to our public sector customers. But I also say to them, you don't have to take it from me. I'm not the only one who's saying this. Gartner's been saying this for the last 6 years. 6 years ago, they introduced their cloud infrastructure as a service Magic Quadrant, and for 6 years running, Amazon Web Services has been in the top right-hand corner, what they call the Magic Quadrant. So measuring two axes, completeness of vision and ability to execute. But it's also not just me, it's all your peers. 2,300 government agencies just like you are running production workloads on AWS, 7,000 educational institutions, more than 22,000 not-for-profit organisations. But the customer momentum is not only global, it's here in APJ. Smartphone picture number 4. These are your peers in Asia Pacific and Japan who are running production workloads on AWS. You saw some of them present this morning, GovTech, SLA. You know Singapore Post. You know Australia Post. You know the Land Transport Authority. Name brand organisations betting their businesses or their organisations' production workloads on AWS. So last picture. So smartphone picture number 5. What do customers tell me are the benefits of moving to AWS? This one slide captures one or more of the reasons why the vast majority of our customers move to Amazon Web Services. They want the ability to trade capital expense for variable expense. They want to move from that feast or famine model to one where they pay as they go. The more they use, the more they pay. The less they use, the less they pay. Secondly, they want to benefit from that flywheel that I talked about. They could never possibly build out the sheer size and scale of the regional global infrastructure that we have around the world. They could never buy at the price point that we can from the wholesalers. They could never imagine the economies of scale. So let us do that for you, and you benefit from those economies. Thirdly, they want to stop guessing capacity. Who's ever been involved in IT capacity planning? No one ever sat down around a table with a CIO who said, right, by the end of this meeting, I want us to forecast exactly how many servers we're going to need in 5 years' time. How many workloads have we got at the moment? How many new projects are coming? What will their requirements be? When will they install them? What will they need? Will we be too high? Will we be too low? And what does that top right-hand corner look like? And then at the end of the meeting, the CIO goes, and now add 20% to it, just in case we got it wrong. And then you start procuring against that projected capacity, only to find two things happen. What's the first thing that happens? You think the demand was going to be this, but the demand was actually far in excess of what we'd guessed. What happens then? Customers can't get access to your services or solutions, and we have very unhappy customers. So we have the CEO on our phone. If we got it wrong on the low side, who's the next person who comes through our door? Usually the CFO. Why have you just tied up $17 million in building out servers that are only running at 6% utilization? You told me we'd be at 80% by now. Fourth reason, increased speed and agility. Mark was talking about the ability to spin up those servers in a matter of minutes. If I can spin things up in minutes, try something, fail, and get a bill for $2 or $3, think how many things I could try in a very small, concentrated window of time. Imagine the agility that that would bring to our organisations. Just think of one thing that happens to all of us in government, a machinery of government change. New departments are formed. 2 departments become 1. 1 department becomes 2. And all the machinations that need to change that go around that. So the fifth construct is you leaving the undifferentiated heavy lifting to us. So we'll take care of the data centers, the speeds, the feeds, the power, the cooling, the resourcing, the security. We'll concentrate on those things that do not differentiate your organization from any other organization that needs the public cloud, while you concentrate on the things that only you and your organization can do. Finally, believe it or not, the sixth benefit for public sector customers moving to AWS is because we improve their security and compliance posture. The standards that we need to adhere to in our regions around the world and the audits that are produced against those are usually far superior to what most government departments and agencies use for their own data centers. So the final part of my presentation, you have an evaluation form. It's on your seats underneath you. You'll see my session there, and you'll recall my favorite number was. Thank you very much.